Hi there, my name is Dr. Katie Saint, and this video is on food selectivity. So, we're talking about picky eaters. So, I am going to go ahead and share my screen and we will dive into it. If you are watching this video and you have a loved one with autism or you work with people with autism, chances are you've run into this issue. The research shows us that it is about 90% of people with an autism diagnosis struggle with food selectivity. So, before you figure out what to do about it from an ABA standpoint, we want to dive into other factors. So, factors could include stomach issues, nutritional deficits can cause eating behavior, good or bad. Allergies, food sensitivities, other medical issues, or even oral motor or swallowing issues. So, consulting with a speech pathologist or a medical doctor, things like that are super important to rule out where the eating pickiness is coming from. Because sometimes these things can be treated medically or they can be treated by learning different oral motor muscle movements, swallowing techniques, all that kind of stuff. So we want to make sure before we treat it behaviorally that there isn't other things causing it. But from there, there's a ton that we can do to help from an ABA perspective on food pickiness. So, some common issues we see is just straight up food refusal. This can result in nutritional deficits. Some of our kiddos are so picky that they are not eating enough foods from different food groups and they have actual medical issues because of it. And some of our kiddos just aren't getting enough calories in because they're so picky. For some of our kids, part of their issue is they refuse to sit during mealtime and they're just constantly moving, constantly on the run. And so that can cause issues with their eating behavior as well. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about PICA. Now, this is kind of the opposite issue where people are eating things that they shouldn't and eating non edible objects. Sometimes this can be very dangerous. So, we're going to talk a little bit about where that comes from and how to treat it as well. So, exposure is something that's really backed by science that is effective for treating pickiness. So, the research shows us that our food preference is largely based on exposure. So, if you've experienced traveling, you'll see in different cultures, people eat very different things. So, different parts of the world, bugs are delicacies. It's a fancy thing that will pay money for, right? But around here in Wisconsin, you don't see a lot of people eating bugs, so that's an example of, depending on where you live, what you eat is going to be really different. But the same thing applies in your own home. So if your child is never exposed to fruits and vegetables, chances are they're not going to like them. And then when we think about the autism diagnosis, that makes it even more likely because part of the autism diagnosis is that there's a resistance to change and a love for routine. So, if there is no exposure to these foods that you want your child to eat, then it's going to be tricky to get them to eat those foods. So, even if the child's not eating the food, just being exposed to it is good for them. So, we're going to go into a little bit later about how to systematically do an exposure program where you are just slowly exposing them more and more until they're eventually putting it in their mouth, they're eating it in this stress-free environment. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But something to keep in mind with exposure, I have seen some families be super ambitious with, okay, we're going to just start exposing them to all sorts of different foods. Well, it's going to be more effective if you target a smaller number to start with because it's going to be easier to have more exposures. It's going to be easier to really desensitize and pair it with reinforcement. So to start with, I wouldn't do more than 4 foods at once that you're really targeting to increase. That way you can have enough exposures to really see that progress you're looking for. So behavioral momentum is a strategy that you can use in the moment that works with lots of behavior, not just food behavior. And so the way behavioral momentum works is you do requests that you think they are very likely to say yes to. Say it's no big deal whatsoever for your child to touch their nose and then touch their head. Well, if you were to say quickly in a row, touch your nose, touch your head, now take a bite, people are more likely to keep following your directions if they just did 2 in a row before that. So you can try this out on your spouse, you can try this out on your kids. This strategy works with all humans. And obviously, it's not foolproof. If you ask your spouse, like, give me a hug, give me a kiss now, let's move to the Bahamas, you might not get a yes. But if the third request is it within reason, a lot of times you're going to get that behavioral momentum continuing in that direction where you do get yeses. So this is just a simple strategy that you can try out. Keep in mind timing is important. If you spread it out too far, it's less effective. So part of what makes the momentum work is that you do it fast right in a row. So the next one is actually a pairing procedure. And so what that means is you put out their favorite food and you put out the food that you want them to eat at the same time. And so every single time that they see their favorite food, they're going to see this food that you want them to eat as well. And so what happens when we do that is our brains start to associate those things together. If you do that with enough repetitions, if you do that enough times, they start to associate them together. And so the food that they love, that power and that influence starts to leak over to the other food, and it helps them to not be so averse to this other food that you want them to eat. So keep in mind, if you do this, it takes a lot of repetitions. So you're going to want to do this consistently over time in order to see results. The next strategy is also a pairing procedure, but this one you expose them to their non-preferred food first, but then immediately after they get their preferred food. So this creates a really positive association as well. And so our brains are constantly recording things and constantly associating things together. So when things are presented at the same time or immediately after, our brain connects those things. So if every time you leave your grandma's house, you see a red car, you might associate a red car with your grandma's house, right? So our brain just keeps records of things unconsciously. We're always doing this. So if you do this with food, you can use it to your advantage. So every time you expose them to that non-preferred food, you're immediately following it up with their preferred food. You're going to start to make that positive association and you're going to see some improvements there. But it only works if you do lots of repetitions because you need a lot of repetitions to reprogram your brain. So this next concept is called establishing operations, and this is really analyzing their motivation. So depending on what they're exposed to previously, this is going to impact whether or not they eat, how much they want to eat. So are they hungry? Are they thirsty? Are they tired? Are they exhausted? All of those factors influence their motivation. So if you want your child to try new food, but they just had a giant plate of French fries, chances are they're not going to be very motivated. So you want to intentionally plan these things out so that what they've been exposed to prior is going to help you um, have a successful food exposure rather than they're just full, so they're not interested, or they have a stomach ache and they're not interested. So you want to make sure the environment has established the motivation rather than wrecked it because of other factors not even related to the food necessarily. So next, differential reinforcement is a strategy that we use in ABA all the time. And so this is just focusing on the behavior of eating. So what we want to do with differential reinforcement is we want to give a lot of attention and positivity to the behaviors we want to see more of. And then we want to kind of ignore or just not respond to negative attention. So if your child takes a bite or sniffs or licks a food that you want them to interact with, praise them, give them attention, do whatever the child likes in that moment so that they're creating positive associations with that behavior. But then when they're refusing to eat the food, when they're getting up and walking away, or they're doing all these different things that are not what you want to see, you simply don't engage. And so this is called differential reinforcement, where we're paying lots of attention to the good stuff and then we're just disengaging from the bad stuff. This is very powerful for shaping behavior. So be mindful of if you're accidentally doing the opposite. This unfortunately happens a decent amount in homes because problem behavior sometimes is really effective at getting our attention. We don't want our kids hitting, we don't want our kids throwing, so we jump in, but when they're behaving well, sometimes we don't interact because that's our 5 seconds that we can focus on something because we're so busy or whatever, so we want to be mindful of this pattern so that our kids are getting attention when they're doing the things that they want to do. We want to make this more effective for them. So positive or negative reinforcement. And so we're using these terms as defined by applied behavior analysis. And so positive reinforcement means if your child does something that you want them to do, in this case, eating food or sitting at the table, things like that, you're going to give them some sort of reward, whether it's praise, whether it's food that they like, an object, an activity, doesn't matter. So that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is taking away aversive things as a reward. So if you eat these vegetables, you don't have to do the dishes after dinner. That would be negative reinforcement because you are removing bad things as a benefit to the person. So this can be very powerful for motivating our kiddos to eat. This is a strategy that you can use and you can get creative with in order to motivate your child. So next is intentional timing of eating. So some of our kiddos snack all day long. And so they're never like super hungry. Or sometimes we have them eat a full meal and then we expose them to these non-preferred foods. And chances are they're just not going to be hungry if we do this. So intentionally exposing them to these new foods that we're hoping they'll eat once they haven't eaten in 2 hours or something like that. That's really going to increase our success rate so that our children are motivated and hungry and more willing to eat. Next is shaping procedures. So one thing that we have had a ton of success with is doing procedures where we start out with they just have to tolerate the food on their plate. And for some kids, we need to start even farther back than that, where the food is just on the table. And so we start there and we provide reinforcement for them just tolerating it. So then once they're tolerating it on the plate, no problem. Then we have them just like kiss it quick and put it back on the plate. And that's it. That's all they have to do to interact with it. Or maybe we just have them touch it and hold it. So we break it up into these small steps where they just have to briefly interact with it. And then once they can do that in a way that is stress free, we're trying to make this a really positive experience. So we're making positive associations with that food. We slowly and gradually build up. Okay, they're kissing it now, they're licking it, they put it in their mouth, they chewed it, they swallowed it. Each one of those we focus on for maybe a week or 2 weeks. Each step we spend time on until they're super comfortable and it's just no big deal, not a stressful thing at all. So this is really effective at desensitizing people to different aversions they have to food. And sometimes it eventually turns that food into a preference. So remember that first slide where we were talking about exposure. This is a way that we can turn a non-preferred into a preferred preference through exposure, but we just do it slowly and systematically over time. So next is just consistency and routine. So if you're only working on this once in a while, you're probably not going to make a lot of progress. Working on it every day or 5 days a week is going to make so much difference in the amount of progress you see. So being consistent with your plan, following through, doing it on a frequent basis is how you're really going to see results. So next I want to talk about if your child is in the category where they struggle to sit during meals and you want to have a family mealtime, but you can't because they just won't sit. There's a bunch of different things that we can do from a behavioral standpoint to reinforce this behavior and get it established. And so one is differential reinforcement. So this is what we were talking about earlier, where we are reinforcing when they're sitting and we are giving them lots of attention, lots of praise if they like that sort of thing. Keep in mind, if they don't like praise and attention, don't do that when they're sitting and attending, because reinforcement only works if the child likes it. So if the child doesn't like it, we're actually going to have the opposite effect. So if your child likes praise and attention, give them that when they're sitting. But then when they're doing things other than that, we want to disengage and not give them that attention. Token systems refers to reward systems where sometimes we might have a timer out or a visual and we say, okay, you need to sit for 5 minutes and then you can get up. And if you do that, then you get X reward. And you can decide whatever you want that reward to be. You want to make sure it's motivating. You want to keep in mind that people get sick of their rewards and they eventually wear out and you need new ones. So you want to stay fresh with what you're using as reinforcement. But that can go a long way. So again, consistency and routine is super, super important, because if you are only working on this once in a while, if you are only telling them to stay seated once in a while, chances are they're not going to do very well with this skill. So whenever you decide to target this, make sure everybody's on board to follow through. Make sure you're willing to work on this many days a week, because if you don't, it's going to be harder to make progress. And so then lastly is just first then. This is just a super easy strategy where you say first this, then iPad, or first you eat 5 bites, then you can get up. So you just make a really clear, and sometimes we do this as a visual. The visual seems to really help. A lot of the research says that people with autism process things visually better than by listening. So this can be a really good strategy too if you make a visual of it. And you can just determine what you want them to do and what the criteria is before they get the reward. And this works really good. So next I want to talk about PICA. So PICA is kind of the opposite of what we've been talking so far, in that people eat things that they're not supposed to eat. They're putting things in their mouth that are not edible. So I've seen lots of kiddos eat drywall or staples, even pencils, pens, all sorts of things around the house that they really shouldn't be eating, rocks, things like that. This can become a dangerous habit. And so it comes from a lot of different places. So sometimes it can be learned or taught in the environment through accidental shaping procedures where people gave it attention and the kid was like, "Ooh, I got lots of attention from that." And maybe people were being like, "Don't eat that." But it just felt good to that child to get that attention so that made it more likely to happen in the future. Stress or anxiety can actually cause this. And so we see this happening with children who have stressful home environments, maybe a high conflict, maybe abuse or neglect, even things like that. We do see an increase in this behavior. Attention seeking behavior for this is pretty common. Like I said earlier, that can be really powerful if the child learns, oh my gosh, if I put this in my mouth, people come running and they stop what they're doing and all eyes are on me. This feels great, right? So that can happen sometimes. Nutritional deficits can be a cause of this. We've seen this a lot where people are low in different minerals, different nutrition. And so they went to the doctor, they got tested, and they were able to just treat it that way, and the behavior went away. Mental health conditions can cause this, medical conditions, and even medication. So that's why if somebody has this behavior, typically our recommendation is to go to the doctor first. We want to rule out all these medical potential causes. And so if we have ruled that out, then the two primary methods for treating PICA is coping mechanisms and differential reinforcement, right? So if it's emotionally based behavior, if they're doing it as a coping mechanism for stress or anxiety, then we want to give them different coping mechanisms, and then we want to reinforce them for using those coping mechanisms. So that is one of the primary strategies we can use. And then the other one is differential reinforcement, right? So we want to praise them when they're eating appropriate things. We want to praise them when they've gone a long time without eating things that they shouldn't, right? Give them all that attention, give them reinforcement, give them rewards, right? But then when they're engaging, we are not giving them that attention. We're not giving them those rewards, and so then there's structure in place so that the child learns when I eat things that I'm not supposed to, I don't like the reaction I get. But when I am eating appropriately and not eating things that I'm supposed to, then I do like the reaction I get, right? So that differential reinforcement is really powerful and it is shown to be one of the leading treatments for this. So it works really good. And if you want to implement something like this, your team can help you design a treatment package for this. So to conclude, if you have a child who is a picky eater and you are struggling with this, rule out medical causes because that can be a big factor. Behavioral treatment is highly effective. There are lots of things that we can do in order to increase eating behavior. This has been effectively treated with ABA for many, many, many years, and there's a ton of research to back this up. But always remember, no strategy is going to work if you're not consistent. So once you decide to work on this, really commit to consistency and routine so that you can increase the odds of getting the results you want. Alrighty, well, everyone, thank you so much for listening. I hope that this video was helpful. And please contact your ABA team if you want more in-depth help with making a plan for addressing picky eating behavior. This is something that we can make a ton of progress on. So if you're feeling like this is a source of stress for you, definitely reach out. All right, thanks so much.